Yeah, and I asked a historical Jesus one, which I don't blame you for taking the time to actually try to spell that out because it's difficult. There's strange stuff. The eunuch, right? If you can, there's the encouragement of being a eunuch. From what I understand, eunuchs are in a different category than just male female. They kind of are their own little category. Am I right in this assumption? And why is he encouraging that? Is this really the voice of the author and what the kind of Christianity of the time is trying to portray, you think?
Well, that's all really hard to say.
Right.
So, first question: what are eunuchs in the ancient world? The eunuchs become symbolic for a lot of different things in the ancient world. They become a symbol for the avoidance of sex entirely. Although we know that they didn't avoid sex. People think, oh, eunuchs couldn't have had sex. Yeah, they could, and they did. There are lots of different ways of making a man into a eunuch. And the different procedures that you use would have to do with whether he could still have an erection, whether he could still ejaculate, and whether he was still fertile enough to procreate. Now, most of the time he wasn't fertile enough because they usually tried to make sure he couldn't have children. And that's because the reason they used eunuchs was not to preserve the purity of the eunuch. It's because they used eunuchs to take care of their women, their wives and daughters. Mm-hmm. And so they wanted, and people usually knew that there were stories all over the place about eunuchs having wild sex with women in harems and palaces and things. And they probably could have, because there are lots of different ways to have sex. You don't have to have it the old-fashioned way. You can use all kinds of different body parts, and they did. But the real push for it was that, even if you have a eunuch in your wife's bedroom who is kind of noodling her, or getting nasty with her, the thing you're mainly concerned about is that you don't want any children to come out of this, because then you could not legally figure out whether they were your children or not.
Right. So it's once again a procreation thing, and we get that weird thing in one of the pastorals. I say weird because you could see there's a reaction. I think it's later. I think this is a later pastoral. I can't remember if it's the name of Peter or not, but it talks about women getting salvation like by becoming baby making machines. Like,
yeah, 1 Timothy.
Okay, it's Timothy. Got it. 1 Timothy. Yeah, that one always struck me as like odd. Like somebody's really upset here.
Yeah, in fact, it literally says they will be saved through childbirth.
Yeah, someone's on a protest, not digging what's going on. So eunuchs play a special role. I wanted to bring that up because we're dealing with sex. We're dealing with the single savior, Jesus, and how it's portrayed within our gospel narratives. And it also, in light of current events, like many Christians who are so reluctant to people playing some category outside of the typical male or female role. It's like, hey, your own savior, according to the gospels that you believe is him speaking, is encouraging this. So you might want to take some notes and understand your understanding is probably mistaken on understanding the ancient world. I just wanted to bring that up as we're edging into this. So
yeah, I do think that the eunuch saying probably does go back to the historical Jesus. That's a big debate. Did Jesus himself really make any such statement about eunuchs? I think he probably did, just because because we find it in more than one place, it tends to come up, and because even among some original Christian writers who passed on that saying, they didn't necessarily agree with it. So one of the rules about when you find a saying that says it comes from Jesus, then you have to say, well, one of the ways to argue that it does come from Jesus is that it doesn't, let's say it doesn't pass the sniff test for whether it links up with the true beliefs of the author.
Mm-hmm.
And when it doesn't, then you say, well, maybe he found it in a tradition and decided to include it anyway, even though he didn't fully agree with it.
That usually, it's almost like a dissimilarity argument or argument of embarrassment. It doesn't prove it goes back to Jesus, but it raises the probability that this could have gone all the way back, correct?
Yes, in fact, I didn't use the terms dissimilarity or embarrassment, but that's exactly what I was talking about.
Got it.
Usually goes under that kind of label. It's an argument that usually goes under that label.
Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. So I've got a comment here, and this is actually from Richard Carrier's blog pertaining to the topic of the two Greek words, melikoi, and then I mess up the other one pretty badly. It's arsenoiki or something like this. And how do you pronounce it?
The longer word is arsenokoites.
Arsenokoites. Okay.
And the short word is malakos.
Got it. Well, he says, and I'm just going to read what he says and then get your thoughts, because he obviously is not a believer. You have fundamentalists who obviously weaponize this, and there are some who approach this who have disagreements no matter where you are on the spectrum. But I wanted to approach Paul here. And so he says the liberal critic is correct that the other type of person Paul puts on his list of the damned, the unmanly, sometimes translated effeminate as if meaning gay, for example, in Greek, the melikoi, I'm butchering these pronunciations, did not refer to gay men, but soft, cowardly, morally weak people of any gender, i.e. not the effeminate, but the profligate. So this had no particular connotation against gay men, nor should we expect it to. Paul already listed gay men, so he would not list them twice, but list gay men as damned he did. And in the most literal way, one could manage in Greek using the word arsenoiki, or however you pronounce this particular Greek word, a compound word, which to bed, which has a different root meaning, but the same valence as the Latin coitus, literally meaning betters of men. Hence, this word refers to any man who has sexual intercourse with another man. It's pretty clear what Paul means by this. Gays are damned. This is what Paul means, according to him. I'm sure you've heard this 1,000 times, especially in this research. What's your take on this as you've investigated the topic?
Well, the people who make those kinds of arguments don't know anything about linguistics. They don't understand language. They don't understand how language works. And I just would press them and say, okay, I say I understand the Constitution. Well, does that mean I'm standing under the Constitution? If I take the word understand apart into its two different components and define each of the components individually, and then just slap the word back together and expect that word to mean the combination of these two components, that's just not the way language works. I mean, you can come up with thousands of examples,
So just to emphasize for our audience, betters of men, for example, if you just took this word, you're saying the meaning of the word itself isn't just straight up what you're reading, understanding I'm not standing under the Constitution, but what does the word mean in your research?
Okay, people have to realize, this is something I've spent half my career trying to lecture on. When writers of dictionaries write definitions for words, how do they do it? Just use empiricism. Just walk around behind people who did the editor for Webster's dictionary and see, how do they make their decisions? Where do they go for their research? How do they decide what things mean? They never, ever, ever, ever take a word, take it apart into a multisyllabic word, and take it apart into its different components, define each of those different components literally,
right,
and then shove it all back together and say it's some kind of combination of those. That's just not how they work. That's not how the way language works. Now, I use the word understand as one example because everybody knows that it doesn't mean to stand under. Now, you might kind of come up with some creative way to say, well, maybe understand originally did mean to stand under. Yeah, to place yourself under the meaning of this word. Well, that's fine if you want to make that your imagination, but there's no evidence for it. Scholars want to have evidence.
Right.
We don't want to have your stupid speculations. But that's what almost all these speculations about arsenokoites, meaning arseno, male, koites, meaning bed. Now look, even there, they make a lot of advances without any proof. They had termed that arsenos refers to any male, no matter what age or situation. And they infer that koites doesn't necessarily mean bed. It metaphorically, they mean sex. Because I can sleep in a bed with a man all the time and not have sex with him.
Right. It's almost like an Adam knew Eve. Well, he knew her. We know what that means, but
yeah.
Right. Okay.
So the way you figure out what a word means is you look at all the different contexts for that word you can find in a certain social context. Now, the problem is arsenokoites occurs only about 5 or 6 times in the ancient world. It's very rare. And it's almost all in Christian texts.
Mm.
And almost all of them, in fact, all of them, post-date Paul.
That's the hard part.
So, you can't look at Paul and say, okay, well, let's go look for a dictionary from before Paul's time and say, okay, how did they define arsenokoites? Well, it doesn't exist. And so people will just say, oh, well, we'll just make it up. We'll just say that, Paul must have meant men who have sex with men, because arseno is male, and koites is bed, but it can also mean sex. Well, what is it? Well, why don't you just be literal about it and say men who sleep on beds? That makes just as much sense as what you're saying.